Welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise, a podcast about living with ME and chronic illness, creativity, and making meaning. I'm joined today by Eliza Charley. Did I say your name right? Because I realised I didn't ask.
You did. Lovely to be
Um,
here.
Eliza is an Australian actor, writer, director, and producer. She works in film, television, and theatre, and she's drawn to the power of storytelling to impact culture and change lives. She specialises in the intersection of women, chronic disease, and the arts, and she seeks to create opportunities for creators to thrive in a sustainable and accessible industry. So I'll just nick that off your website. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, I just realized it needs a slight updating because I've been really sick the last 3 years since I wrote that. It's all
Got you.
still true. I'm just not able
Yeah.
to do as much at the moment.
That's the frustrating part of it, isn't it? When you kind of you sort of actually you can write something down about who you are, and then it's like, actually, how do I then
Yeah.
incorporate? But yeah, so um, as an actor, you've worked on The Fort 2021, which came out. Did it come out last year? Because I was doing a bit of sort of research and I was trying to
Yeah.
figure it out because it seemed like it was a pandemic thing, and then it kind of I couldn't find it to watch though, so I was a bit frustrated that I couldn't
Yeah,
find it
that's
to watch.
right. At the moment, it's mostly being shown actually for educational purposes because it focuses on the very serious issue of domestic violence in Australia, which is a huge problem. And so they've been having sort of pop-up events and they'll put together a panel of experts and discuss it. I think it's a really wonderful model what they're doing with the film. And there's been some overseas pop-ups as well. There was one in New York, for example. But I think it's going to be like a bit of a slow burn, and it's always encouraging though when people do see the film. But yeah, at the moment it's not available video on demand, but I don't know, that could be
Hmm.
changing. We'll see.
That would be good at some point, yeah. And Time Apart, and then also Neighbours. So that was something I'm sure a lot of our British and Australian sort of listeners and viewers would appreciate that. It was a big part of my kind of upbringing, Neighbours. So yeah, was that a
Yeah,
big
me
thing, kind
too.
of sort of taking part in that and being a part of it?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing actually. It was only a couple of episodes when they started having additional episodes that were just available online. So they had this side story where they were introducing two new main ongoing characters for Neighbours, and I was a part of their story of how they got to Melbourne and how they got to Ramsay Street in Neighbours. Um, but we still shot it on the Neighbours lot and, with the
Mm.
staff. And so I was a little bit, I kind of retreated back into being a bit starstruck. Like I'm sitting in the Kennedy's kitchen. Like I grew up
Yeah.
watching this set, and it was
Wow.
just really fun, but also a little bit of a, it was a little dream to be a part of
Yeah.
that show, even though I was in it a part of it in such a micro way. I
Yeah.
loved it, and it was a beautiful team we shot with. It was really fun.
Yeah, yeah. It's sort of like anybody that kind of grew up in the 90s, and yeah, it's like it's just what you did at the end of the day. You sat down and watched Neighbours. It was just kind of like, yeah. And interestingly for me, I grew up being ill and not being at school, so I often used to watch Neighbours at lunchtime, which is what most people didn't get a chance to do when they were sort of at
Yeah.
school. So yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because they used to show it twice a day over here on on BBC
Oh,
One. So
right. Actually, I spent
yeah,
six
yeah.
months in the UK when I was 7, I think. And just before we left, we hadn't really watched Neighbours much as a family. And I remember my mum specifically instructing us we had to watch Neighbours because at the time, Neighbours in the UK was behind. And she knew that
Ah,
as
okay.
soon as we were living in the UK, everyone was going to be asking us, like, what happens to this character?
what
And we didn't know. So it was
what
like our
happened?
homework preparing for this sort of sabbatical that my parents were taking for their work. Our
I
homework was
love
to
that.
watch Neighbours, which was pretty cool for a family that didn't watch a lot of TV. That was an exciting step.
That's brilliant. Yeah, yeah. Whereas, yeah, for us, it was always like trying to sneak in and watch it before my parents called us for like tea and stuff like that. Yeah, it was always
Yes.
tea time. So yeah, if I got to watch it in the lunchtime, that was. Anyway, that's not not talk. We're not here to talk about sort of my TV watching habits. But yeah, it's no, it's really good to have you here. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your background, your history, and then maybe a bit about your ME story, and because you're
Yeah.
quite an advocate for that as well. So
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I said, I'm so happy to be here and I really appreciate what you're doing, helping people to share their stories. I noticed in your introduction, you mentioned that part of the podcast is about creativity as well. And I do think there is a lot in telling our stories that can be really powerful in helping um, sometimes access people's minds who on the surface don't initially understand the disease. But I think through the
Mm.
power of story, you can begin to really build an affinity with a character if it's fiction, or a real person if it's in this situation. And it can begin just to maybe peel away some of the layers and help people to access the resources that they already have, like compassion and a fierceness for advocacy. I think a lot of people have these inner resources, but until they really click with the story, they can sometimes not understand how necessary and urgent advocacy is,
Mm.
and especially from able-bodied allies like friends and family and
Mm.
people. A lot of people have someone in their orbit who has this disease, and they don't realize just how serious the sort of global issue is. So I'm really happy to be here and share my story. I have taken a long time to be brave enough to tell my story anew. And partly it's because it's been now over quite a few years, which I'll explain in a moment. But
Mm.
I didn't have the language for more than a decade on how to talk about my disease and my experience of the illness. And I tried to do some writing, and I tried to share my story, even tried some creative projects. But whenever I did, I realized that, within a year or two, the facts of what had happened to me were the same, but my understanding of them was different. And a lot
Mm.
of that change in my understanding of it was peeling back layers of misinformation that I had received, especially early on in my disease, about how the disease is framed, and ideas, notions around what causes it or how to treat it. I had taken a lot of that on board just because the usually trusted figures, such as doctors or
Mm.
family members who work in medicine, I trusted and believed them. And it wasn't intentionally malicious on their behalf. It was just the extent of misinformation that's now embedded in the system. So this actually
Mm.
meant that I lost my confidence for a few years talking about my disease, because I felt like I had misinterpreted my own story. And even now, I don't know
Wow.
if I'll understand some of it differently in the future when we have even more biomedical evidence and even more
Mm.
understanding of the actual mechanisms of the disease. But I've realized that that's even more important, a reason to talk about it now, because this is a snapshot in time. And I, I, yeah, I just think it's important to try, even if I fail miserably. So here I am.
Yeah, no, thank you.
That said, as best as I have language to currently describe it, I have viral onset, relapsing remitting, myalgic encephalomyelitis. Uh, and in Australia, they only use the word CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, in terms of diagnosis and things. But I meet the international consensus criteria, the Canadian consensus
Mm.
criteria, all those really strict ones about what is and isn't ME. That's the diagnosis that I have, and that's been confirmed by specialists now on multiple continents. um, so that's the best language I have to describe it. And in brief, I had a very ill period in my early 20s. I was 21, I think, when I first caught the virus. It's coming up
Mm.
to 15 years.
Wow.
This last week, I think, was 15 years. I've
Mm.
just been sort of processing that milestone. 15 years ago, I was in my early 20s, and I was immediately overnight, I caught this virus and my body was changed. That first week, I knew it was a doozy of a virus because it worked through every system in my body. I had like a day of respiratory coughing and things, a day of headaches and migraines and like pulsing in the brain, a day of neural shocks and kind of weird nervous system stuff, a day of really of vomiting and things with my gut. Like it just went through every organ
Mm.
of the body, it seemed. And then on day 5, I was like, oh, or day 6, I'm like, okay, I think this is passing. And I tried to go back to work and I was just so ill. I came home. And at the time, I remember
Mm.
thinking, like, who takes 5 days off work to be sick? Like, you must be really sick. That's 5 days. Like, I'll be
Yeah.
back to work on Monday. Be
Yeah.
fine. Lo and behold, took a little longer. And I ended up having to, I'd been working full time. I had to drop hours, and I just dropped my hours and dropped my hours and dropped my hours. I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I tried to go back to uni part time because I thought if I was home, maybe I could do online courses. I didn't understand the cognitive toll of this disease.
Mm.
And the patterns of PEM were there from day one. I've gone back and looked at my Facebook posts, like my
Mm.
wall,
Yeah.
and there's a message from a family member who was overseas at the time. Like, I'd been sick for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and they were like, "Oh, like, how are you going?" And it was all when all your messages to people were completely public. Early days of Facebook, we had no idea it was on the internet and
Yeah, yeah,
purposely.
yeah.
And, how are you going? And my language is something like, I don't have it to hand, but it's something like, it's really weird. I'll think I'm getting better, and then I'll like work or do something for a day. And every time I try to do something, I'm back in bed for 3 days. That's so
Mhm.
weird. Now I know that is just like the hallmark of early PEM, like
Yeah.
absolutely. And if there had been someone in my life, or my GP who I did see at the time, had been able to recognize that pattern and help me, who knows how the course might have changed. But we know we don't have all the answers anyway. But I was in cycles of PEM and crashing throughout that time, and it was several years. Throughout that time, I went through all of the usual uh, medical pathways for this disease that I now know can do more harm than good. So I did graded exercise therapy and got worse
Mm.
because of they put me through CBT alongside it around illness beliefs. I would say that I was improved from it, or that I was like glad I'd done the program, but on paper I could do less, and my whole function
Mm.
had dropped. I'd lost the last hours of work. I had to completely defer the university that I'd started as a consequence, and I got worse as a consequence from that program. Um, and at the time, I thought that was just me. I was like, "Oh, that sucks. This is such a
Yeah.
weird, everyone's different disease. This language you use that's really vague. We don't know what's going on." I didn't realize that actually it's very normal to get worse from graded exercise therapy. And we actually know why, and
Mm.
more evidence is showing why it can make you worse, and why it's so dangerous. So I went through all of that rubbish. And then I had a year of proper bed, couldn't do anything really, um,
Mm.
but not, it felt very severe. Obviously, it's a severe change to your life, but I wasn't in the very severe category, thankfully. I was still able to do things from time to time. And eventually I started to improve. And part of that was trying to treat chronic infections. There was a few things. I put together a team of people that helped me. And somehow, that feels very lucky, feels kind of by accident, because I know people who have done the same things and haven't improved. My case did respond, improve. And then I had quite a few years of relative health. My immune system never recovered. If my partner at the time got sick and I caught what he had, I would be down for like 2 weeks, like not able to lift my
Mm.
head, not able to work, nothing. And he'd be sick for a couple of days and then be fine. Um, there were things like that that never changed, but I was able to, after a few more years, eventually I was able to exercise again. And I love running, and I love, um, going to the gym, and I had limits. I realized I had these limits, but actually I felt and considered myself a healthy person, even though I had limits. I wish
Mm.
now I'd known that I wish I'd understood it was remission, not recovery, because I would have
Mm.
probably managed things differently, but it is what it is.
Mm.
And then unfortunately, throughout 2018, mostly 2019, sorry, 2019, I got chronic tonsillitis. And I'd always had problems with my tonsils and infections, but I got chronic tonsillitis. And then I got another virus in that winter in Australia. And it was, again, one of those times where something shifted, but I still considered myself a healthy person, which was just me mislabeling what was going on. I didn't
Yeah.
understand. And I had been working full-time hours, piecing together 2 part-time jobs. And like immediately overnight, I had to drop one. And I've never been back to full-time since. But I could still do some exercise. I could do some walking. I couldn't really run. And then in 2020, I had a tonsillectomy because the chronic tonsillitis had got so bad. And that surgery triggered a complete, like full-blown relapse of ME. And I had 6 months of
Mm.
begging my GP for help, trying to explain that something was wrong, trying to explain, I've been through this before. I know something has shifted in my body. I want help.
Mm.
Can we try and see what chronic infections are going on? Can I go back on the medications for POTS that I was on last time that helped? And it was just like, no, 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 no. I literally got mocked. I got laughed out of the office. And this was a GP who I'd known my entire life. Like, it was just quite astounding and is typical, unfortunately. There are exceptions. It's not all doctors, but it is
Mm.
typical to have this. They tried to wish away the POTS and say that everyone has a bit of POTS, which is just bloody
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um, just yeah, all of that. And unfortunately, I after the surgery, I'd taken 2 weeks off to recover from work. I was already working part time, but I never went back. I lost that job because I couldn't go back. And I started to do part time things in like the creative space. Melbourne was coming out of our first big year of lockdowns, and we eliminated COVID, so it was very safe to be out in public unmasked. There was no COVID at the time,
Mm.
but I did eventually then catch something else. Someone who was COVID negative, but an actor that I was working with. I caught something, and I wasn't that sick, but it just knocked my baseline. And then I unfortunately had injury from in response to the vaccine. Vaccines are an amazing scientific tool
Mm.
that we have, but I did have an injury, and I didn't realize that that's quite likely with ME that you might have a negative response, and it set off just a crazy. I shouldn't use the word crazy, but an intensive cycle
Yeah.
of worsening over the rest of that year. And then 2022 was the worst I'd been. And now I'm in an improvement season again in response to medical treatment. So it's been a real roller coaster, and definitely this strange thing of relapsing, remitting. I know not all patients have that,
Mm.
although I have heard quite a few stories of people sick for quite a few years as a child, teenager, or 20s, having some sort of remission or, 60, 70% better even, and then worsening again in their 30s, usually after infections or surgery or some sort of immune triggering event. And I wish I understood all of that more, why that happens. And I
Mhm.
wish I'd been prepared for it, but I wasn't.
Mm.
And here we are, and I'm dealing it with the best way I can. And some of the things that helped me
Mm.
last time didn't help me this time. It's like a different ball game. There's other things
Yeah.
going on, but um, I'm grateful to be in improvement now. And last time, my main goal was to get better so that I could just live some life again and do train properly in acting, really give it a good go. And I did. And I'm so grateful for those years of life. I have good memories from the second half of my 20s, from a lot of good that happened and a lot that I could do. This time, getting better has been, or having any improvement has been much more about wanting to use that for advocacy and to fight for better.
Mm.
Because, yeah, the neglect is beyond comprehension on a systemic level, and it has
Mm.
to change. And I hope that even the tiny offerings I can give can be part of that change.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting you sort of saying about like, having that sort of periods of remittance and then, kind of up and down and I had that when I was younger with ME in my
Mm.
teens and then I had like nearly 20 years where I was kind of saw myself as being better, like recovered, like really, and then it kind of like hit, like you said, like in my 30s, what was it, 36 or something. It just like kind of
Yeah.
just hit me. So there seems to be sort of like common themes often there, doesn't there, in terms of like
Mm.
how then how sometimes younger people do recover, but then it kind of hits us as well later, which for me I wasn't ever expecting. It wasn't ever something that I thought was going to kind of be in my life again. So it's
Yeah. I
yeah
had
it's
zero. I actually believed that it couldn't come back, which is silly because there's actually a lot of evidence that it can. But I
mm,
just, like, I believed that it couldn't come back and had no expectation this would be part of my life again. I'm so sorry
yeah
that's happened to you too.
yeah yeah
When it came back for you, um, it's such a shock. Was sort of my
mm.
experience, to be like, oh, I know what this is, and I can't believe it's
Yeah,
happening again.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah, definitely. And it was like I went through an autumn period where I was getting like tingles in my like legs and my hands and things like that, and you're thinking, and is it like an MS thing? And I was literally like, yeah, there's something there that kind of makes you step back and think, is this ME? And it's always there at the back of your mind, isn't it? When you've lived with it and then you've recovered, it's almost like it's almost like the sort of like it's on your shoulder kind of thing, isn't it? Somehow,
Yeah.
and it's almost like not wanting to even open the door to that question about is this ME, about like it returning when you've had like a really good period, because you know what it means, and you know what it means for your life. Like, and for me, it
Yeah,
was like almost like hoping it would be anything else, and that's like quite a sad thing to think, isn't it? It's
it is. But I
yeah,
totally relate to that. Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you've kind of like been around the houses in terms of like ME treatments and things, haven't you?
Yeah.
And um, that must have been really difficult, going through that period where you were given like graded exercise, but weren't really fully like aware of the impact of what that could mean for you. Was that a really difficult time trying to kind of like make sense of it, and come to
Yeah.
terms with what you were going through and what they were advising?
Yeah, it was. And I think at some point I'll write some sort of piece that relates completely separately in my life. I have some experience with sort of like really intensive religious communities. As
Mm,
like a completely different thing from when I was a child. Well, not a child, but yeah, yes, a child. But anyway, that's another part of my story. But what strikes me now is there are some similarities in terms of the culture. And I think that's what was really hard, because when I was in it, I guess the
mm,
culture of graded exercise therapy and the culture of the CBT that's teaching you to try and like, say no to your beliefs that you're sick, and try to only
mm,
look for the positive, and try to edit out any negative. And then also, brain retraining programs that go alongside that, which I did and I totally bought into, like hook, line, and sinker, paid my last dollars, drank the Kool-Aid, the whole thing.
yeah.
There are elements of it socially and culturally that I find strikingly similar to cultist religious groups. And it tends to be around like some sort of like leadership figure who everything they says is gospel, and any questions you ask are like your questions are reframed and redirected, not actually answered. And you're told what to believe. Um, and the thing that I think, it's one of the things I think is quite insidious about these programs, is because they sell themselves as compassionate, like at least we're trying something when there's no
Yeah, yeah.
approved treatments. But actually, there's a whole like lifestyle that comes with it that, um, they completely controlled and changed the way that I managed my life and how I understood the things that were happening in my life. A small example would be, I remember going in at one stage several months in for like my regular session with the exercise physiologist, and asking like, well, when will I be able to like run and have quite a high heart rate again without like crashing
Yeah.
afterwards? Like, because I'd been an athlete all through high school. Like I played competitive basketball for 10 years. I was captain of the
Mm,
cross country team. Like this was a part of who I was, my identity and what I loved. Like if this program was all about getting me back to health, then if presumably at some stage I would be able to run and have a high heart rate and play competitive sport. And his answer was just, why do you want to? Why do you want to do that? And I was like, oh, and I mean, not just mention the power dynamic, right? Like I would have been 22,
yeah,
23
yeah, yeah.
in this room, door closed, young woman with this like older man telling me what to believe and how to interpret things. And that's just one example of hundreds. Um, but then with one of the brain retraining programs I went to, I found some emails recently that I wrote to the coach a few months after the program. And you can see in the email how I am trying so hard to like apply the process and apply the program and try to use their language, because I'm told that I have to use this language or I'll never get better. I'm trying to say like, I'm better from the program, and I've been able to do, I've been able to do this, but I'm like, but but after the first few weeks, then I was like really sick for a couple of weeks with something. And the coach came back and it was all about like, oh yeah, like, well, sometimes you'll still get sick and it's a setback. But it was PEM. Like now I know
Yeah,
really
yeah,
what
yeah.
PEM is, and the immune response and the blood clots that our muscles create in response to exercise. Like that's what was going on. But he was like, oh, you'll get sick sometimes. And then I was trying to remember to explain to this coach, like, oh, and I'm thinking of, doing some different things with my life. And they were like, yeah, like someone that they knew who'd done the program, like they realized after doing the program that they didn't really want to work full time. They actually only want to work part time. And there's like this reframing, and I believed it. I believed that this was a life that I wanted, but it was a life still of really reduced function because my health hadn't actually changed that much. I was responding
No.
to POTS medication. There was other stuff going on. So I was naturally actually improving at that time from other medical interventions. But it all got reframed and twisted. And I'm still unpicking some parts of that story where it got twisted. But it's this, yeah, that's the bit to me that's a bit cult-like, is that you can come with a problem and come with a question, and it either gets deflected, redirected, dismissed and denied. Minimized is a huge one. Like, oh, is that really a big problem in your life? Or they just reframe it, be like, well, maybe you don't want to work full time. Maybe that's why you're sick. It's your body telling you don't want to work full time. Like, nah, I love work. I love my job. Then went into acting. I love acting, but I would work, when I started working as a producer and like working as an assistant and a runner, like the lowest of the low on the rung, I would work crazy, wild hours for like a few months and then crash for a few months. Everyone else did a project and then went on to the next project and went to the next project. I did a project and then couldn't do anything, for like 2 or 3 months. And I didn't realize even then I was in some cycle. I was just living with a very mild, I was a lot healthier and able to do a lot more, but everything had been twisted by these ideas. And I think it's really insidious, and it all comes back to this root cause of deciding that the illness is about belief and behavior rather than biology. And yes, we're complex humans, we have mind-body connection, all of that, but there is something very distinct and unique happening in the biology of this disease that happens in the same way in millions of bodies without those people ever talking to each other.
No.
Then we meet and can sympathize. But like this happened to me in complete isolation. I had no idea of what was going on in my body, and it still happened. It wasn't me choosing it, and it wasn't me expecting certain symptoms. And it certainly wasn't behavior or me resting too much, because I really didn't rest as much as I should have in the first year.
Yeah.
So I have been around the traps of those programs, and even after I got harmed by them, they harmed my relationship at the time. After the brain retraining one, because you're told to tell everyone in your life that you're recovered, and to the point of I was given A4 sheet printouts to hand people so that I didn't have to talk about the illness at all, that told my family and friends to never ask me about it, that they were no longer allowed to ask me about the illness or mention it, which is just gross. Now it's just disgusting behavior, but I did. And so my partner, I was actually married at the time, so my husband, I mean, he believed the sheet that I gave him, which is why wouldn't he?
It's the
And so he
doctor's,
wasn't
isn't it?
and to ask me about it, and to the point of like other things would happen that I'd get upset about in life, and he'd be like, oh, well, you just need to like do your brain retraining, like don't be upset, like just do your brain retraining. And that, I'm like, well, no, actually it was just something in life that was very normal to be upset about. So it affected my relationships. I mean, it's not the only reason, there's lots of other reasons. I'm no longer married to that person, but the impacts of this can really have ripple effects. It destroys people's bodies physically, that's number one, but it also can destroy your sense of self and knowing your own thoughts, with the gaslighting that comes with it, the deliberate gaslighting, like it's a method of teaching yourself how to gaslight yourself. That is what one of the successes is. So I've really been around the traps with that, and it took me a long time to then be able to talk about it, because I thought I was like the only one. I thought that like I just kind of, it's just me that didn't respond to graded exercise therapy, and maybe it's good for other people. Maybe there's other people it helps. I didn't realize how much I was actually the normal. I was the norm to be harmed, but you're not allowed to talk about it. So now I'm determined to talk about it.
Yeah. And like, there's like so many things that I'm thinking about, like the way that you've unpacked all that, I'm just thinking like I could ask a million different questions, but it's certainly, I can relate to the elements that you were saying in terms of like I haven't talked about sort of religious things really, but like there's a nature where there's a sense of believing something or having faith, therefore equates to it's almost like what's that word that they keep using nowadays about um, you can, if you believe something enough, you can make it happen.
Oh
Um,
yeah, the
uh,
manifesting.
that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah,
Yeah, and there's
yeah,
almost a sense of that, isn't there? That actually, even within faith communities, and like you were saying, it's almost like there's similarities in terms of like this sort of like the cult like nature of investing your belief system in something that is
yeah,
therefore going to have results, and then
yeah,
actually when those promises that are made, or the kind of like the great statements about how something is going to impact your life, whether that's God or a thinking belief system, therefore leads you to a place where you're going to potentially have a sudden realization that these things aren't kind of actually realistically going to impact you in a real way, because the illness is still there whether you believe it's there or not. and
yeah,
and it's yeah. I, I, there's a an element of like self gaslighting then, isn't it? Because you've been taught through this system to actually believe the things that you should be believing, and
mm,
therefore when they're not, you're doing it wrong, and then you're telling yourself you're doing it wrong because it's not
yeah,
working for you.
yeah.
and
That's right.
and
And sometimes they'll outright tell you. Like there were times that I went in and would be like, "I'm really not getting better. I've been in this program for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Like I was really in this thing, and I wasn't working. I didn't. I was beg, borrowing, and stealing to make it happen. Um, I didn't, couldn't afford it and all of that. And, you go and you're like, I don't think I'm actually getting better. I thought I was getting better. I can walk more steps and I
mm,
can walk more minutes, but it's at the sacrifice of being able to do anything else. So I went from working part-time and doing the weekly grocery shopping
yeah,
and being really unwell, but being able to see friends sometimes, to like, I could do this graded exercise level of walking every day that I was meant to do, but I could no longer buy my groceries. I couldn't cook dinner.
yes,
I couldn't care for myself. And I
it's
didn't
not an
have a
extra
lot of
thing, it's
support at
just a
the time. So,
replacement for, yeah.
yeah, like my whole life was actually falling apart around me, but all they cared about was I getting the number of steps that, well, the minutes and like intensity, increasing my heart rate, and increasing the minutes was the measures, and that's all they cared about. So when I'd go in, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and say, I'm just starting to wonder if maybe something else is going on that we need to think about. Like, can we make a different plan? Because I don't think this is helping. Um, they will like straight up tell you like, well, you're doing the exact amount of minutes every day, because I think,
Hmm.
maybe they wouldn't say you're lying, but it was directly implied, because it's like,
Hmm.
if you're not improving, we think this program should work. So like, what are you doing if
Yeah,
it's not working for
yeah,
you?
yeah,
You're not obviously
yeah.
not doing it properly. Um, and apart from the fact that if you're a person in position of power and expertise, then if something's not working for the person who has less power and less expertise, that's not the person with less power's fault. That's your fault for
Hmm.
not explaining it properly or adapting it for them. So setting that
Hmm.
aside, straight up, I just was, not responding and getting
Hmm.
worse. And they didn't have any avenue for that conversation. So the blame was put back on me as a
Hmm.
22-year-old. um,
Yeah,
and like I could get quite emotional about it. Like it's just so wrong, and it's
yeah.
so wrong that like in Australia, that is still the only. Well, it's not official. Well, it is officially approved, but that is the only medical pathway available to you. You can find very
Right.
expensive private functional doctors who know a bit more about the disease. Um, and there's like a handful of specialists in that way, but that can come with its own problems, and they've all got wait lists that are months and months long, especially now with the ongoing pandemic.
Hmm.
So that's not sort of a proper health pathway, and it's not supported and it's not funded. The only real pathway is like fatigue clinics that do graded exercise therapy and psychology.
Yeah.
So this is happening to countless Australians right now, and it's happening
Hmm.
to people who have long COVID with PEM. They're getting put through these programs, and again, it's like they're getting 5, 6 months in, and then jumping into online communities and being like, I don't think I'm recovering. In fact, I
What's
think I
going
might
on
be
here?
getting worse. Has this happened to
Yeah,
anyone? And I'm like, this happened to me like 15 years ago,
yeah, yeah,
13 years ago. Maths on the fly,
yeah,
not my
yeah,
forte. Um,
yeah.
my parents were both scientific researchers and very strong in
Oh
the
wow.
sciences, and I went into the arts.
Yeah,
So maths is not my forte. I mean, I did do a lot of maths, but like not anymore.
it's not my
So
thing.
yeah, it's so wrong. It is unjust. It's wrong in the sense that it's incorrect, but it's wrong on like a moral and ethical perspective. And there's a lot of movement in Australia right now trying to get graded exercise therapy taken down from online guides, but it's there. The Royal
Yeah.
Academy of GPs, what is it, the RACGP, Royal College of Australian GPs. It's their only non-pharmaceutical intervention guide entry for this disease is graded exercise therapy, and it directly links to
Wow.
PACE and says, here are the worksheets from the PACE trial. It explicitly says, we're not talking about pacing. We're specifically talking about increasing your activity and exercise. It's
So is there
untold harm is happening behind closed doors.
is 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 there any suggestion that Australia will take on the UK NICE guidelines, the updated ones? Is that like how do these things happen? I don't know how these
Mm.
things happen in the kind of like ether
Yeah.
of yeah.
We do follow the UK and the US in a lot of things, culturally but in terms of
Mm.
like medical systems and research. But unfortunately, like the misinformation is so ingrained in Australia. There's no one from within the health system really who wants to advocate to have a
Mm.
guideline that's appropriate in Australia because they don't think it's necessary. They will still openly say psychosomatic, this is happening to hypervigilant, anxious women. Like the
Yeah.
language is appalling, and they will outright say this in the newspaper. There was one doctor who runs a long COVID clinic, shockingly, can't believe he's being put in front of patients in Sydney, that was commenting on low dose naltrexone, which is a fantastic medication, doesn't work for all ME patients, makes a few
Mm.
worse, makes a few no change. A lot of people it can help. It's helped me. I'm really grateful to be on LDN now. Took years to fight to get it. Glad to be on it. His comment on LDN was that it was the equivalent of injecting Pinoclean, which is an Australian disinfectant. And I think Pinoclean as the brand should sue the guy because that's just terrible. But
Yeah,
like
to
this is
Donald
being
Trump
published
sort of
in the
thing.
top newspapers.
Mm.
So but that said, there has been a shift in the last probably say 2 years. And it's thanks to a couple of politicians, so my impression is that's maybe similar to what happened to the UK when, is it Carol Monaghan,
Yeah.
got on board with understanding the disease, where there's some fantastic uh, politicians who, just a handful, but they're really
Mm.
starting to understand this. And that's the result of a lot of patient advocates as well, who have like really tried to get this on the agenda. And so there's been a couple of meetings now at Parliament House about this. It's at least documented that it's a problem. And there was a big report just before the pandemic, and the NHMRC, National Research Medical Council,
They
report
like
on,
long names, don't they?
yeah, so many acronyms. They did a big report on like the state of ME or MECFS in Australia, and in it, one of their main recommendations was that there needs to be a guideline created because the only official like comprehensive guideline is from 2002, which my understanding of what I've been told is that by their own legal standards, it's out of date. So it doesn't. So we're essentially working within the framework that there is no official guideline. But there are private guidelines, and then there are things like the RACGP Handy Guide for Non-Pharmaceutical, which has graded exercise therapy. There's these things. So there are some really good people and some really good groups trying to collaborate. But I mean, everyone is, I think, a lot of people are feeling dejected because we've just been shaking trees and knocking on doors and running campaigns for decades, and it feels
Yeah.
like nothing's really changing. And even now there's conversations happening, it can feel like just more talk. But I
Mm.
know behind the scenes, I've been very lucky to meet with a couple of politicians who are working on this and their team of advisors. There are some people who are really taking this on and wanting to get this through. So I
Mm.
think it will take years. but there is change happening now, which I haven't seen for the last 15 years, which I take as a positive sign. But
Yeah.
it's going to be tough because there's a lot of people liable if it comes to light that they knew that they were doing harm and didn't remove the guideline. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The state of play is it's a bit fractured and complex in Australia right now.
Yeah, it sounds
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And equally it is, all over the world in terms of, but it feels like, yeah, it feels frustrating that there's still that that those treatments are on the table and they should not be. And yeah, they
Yeah.
doing nothing is better than doing whatever they're doing through graded exercise. And
Yeah.
you've just
Yeah.
told us and given us a really good example of kind of like what how that's impacted you. And I'm sure that's like it's going to affect people's mental health and all sorts of things in terms of like questioning your own sense of embodiment, I suppose. Is that a term, like of
Mm.
who you are and what your body's telling you, and doubting what your body's telling you. And that's it's really dangerous, isn't it? But it's been
Yeah.
yeah, it's I'm just trying to think of where we could take the conversation, because we've had a fascinating conversation. There's like so many other things that we could talk about, and
Yeah. Well, I liked what you mentioned there about the identity piece, though, about like, I mean, I guess this idea of embodiment and being able to really
mm,
believe your own sensations and believe your own what's happening in your body, even believe the data that's in front of your eyes. Like you can track your heart rate and HRV and all sorts of things and see in the data what's happening in this disease, and you can disbelieve it if you've been taught to sort of disregard biometric data or disregard what's your own experience of it.
mm,
But I think alongside that, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but the identity piece, I think you mentioned this in terms of when you got sick again, there's this almost like really not wanting to believe it because you know what that means.
yeah.
And part of, for me, it's like I know what it means in terms of what it does to my capacity, my function, my experience of symptoms, and like the torturous experience that it can be to be in like horrible PEM or even
mm,
just a really low baseline. Um, but alongside that, there's the identity piece of
mm,
the loss of who you are, and the loss of relationships, but the loss of the way you can connect with the world, the loss of the way you can express yourself. And I think for me, so I was in decline when I moved to Italy to be with my lovely, lovely partner. And the Australian border was closed at the time, and I managed to get permission to move to Italy. And so we're reunited. Um, but for the first 2 years of living here, I could barely see people. And so I could barely meet his family and barely meet his friends. Um, and that wasn't just because of being conscious. We're still very like we only mask indoors and we get people to
mm,
test. We're very conscious COVID wise and infection wise, but also just like physically I couldn't always hold my head up. I couldn't always
yeah.
drink. Like I couldn't always make it to the toilet when I needed to. I can't, like one of the things I love at the moment about being better is I can go and make a cup of tea when I want a cup of tea. I don't have
Mm,
to wait 4 hours or have to make the cup of tea, sit the tea down and recover for 2 hours before I can then drink the cold tea. Like this is the level
right.
of dysfunction we're talking about, and disability. So I couldn't meet with people though. And I think a lot of people get the impression now that a lot of them thought I was like a social recluse, introverted person, which can be a wonderful personality trait. It's just not mine. I am
Yeah.
extremely extroverted. And I think it's a big surprise to people now. And I'm like, hi, tell me your life story. I want to get to know you. Like, and they're like, whoa, she's got so much energy and talking to us. I did not know who this is who she was.
Yeah.
But I couldn't be myself when I'm at my worst because
Mm,
it expels too much energy. And it's my natural personality trait. Extroversion gives you energy as an extrovert. Being around people gives you energy,
mm,
but not when I'm sick, because being around people is the cognition and the social energy and the physical energy. It causes crashes and worsening if I take it to the
mm,
extreme. So I can't express who I am. And I think one thing that happened the first time I was sick, I would have been about 24. And I remember I managed to get to a park and looking up at these gum trees in Australia and just trying to come back to like what is still true about my identity? Because I've lost my job, my university enrollment. Um, my marriage was changing, friendships had changed. I couldn't go to church, which was a big part of my life at the time. Like all these expressions of who I was were gone. I couldn't play sport.
Mm.
I couldn't sit up and play piano for long periods, which is like music was a big part of my life. And I was like, what's still true? And at first I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it slowly came to me. I'm like, well, I'm a 24-year-old person. That's still true.
Yeah.
I'm someone
Yeah.
who's been on this planet for 24 years, and
You're
that means
human.
something. It can mean lots
Yeah.
of different things, but it means something. I am a daughter. I can't be a daughter. Like, I can't really express that part of my relationship very strongly, but I am someone's daughter. And I was someone's wife, and I was like, I'm a woman, and that the being a woman was a part of my identity, and so I really, that was part of who I was, and I just named these things that were still true about who I was, and came to a place where I really had to accept. I think I've written about this somewhere before, but had to accept that there is a quiet nobility to living a small life. And as someone that always wanted to live a big life and have a big personality and just like get amongst everything, loved adventure, loved, making big projects, all this stuff, I had to just accept that the small life wasn't lesser. It
Mm.
was, if anything, it was more noble,
Mm.
and that I had an inner worth just existing, literally
Mm.
lying in bed in the dark, breathing, not being able to eat, or not being able to have light or sound, not being able to have someone in the room with me, whatever it was, I still had worth purely because I was alive and I was a life. And
Mm.
it's become a fundamental value of mine that every life has worth. And I
Mm.
hope that anyone listening to this or watching this, if you've had those times where you feel like like you've lost so much of your identity, I just want to validate that, you know, at least I'm someone who sees that you still have complete worth in existing, and I'm glad that
Yeah.
you're in the world. Um, and those of us that are improving or are more able-bodied will keep fighting to make this world practically better for people who are very severe or severe, for example. But that even in amongst all that loss, just being alive, not being able to think properly, just having to like meditate myself into a trance because anything else was too much energy, I still had worth just being alive.
Mm.
And it's hard because it feels like your life is not witnessed, and your relationships change and your expression of your identity change. And that's all before we get to the question of productivity, which we live in
Mm.
a productivity obsessed culture. And that's obviously off the table. Being productive is off the table in many ways. But that, yeah, you still, there is in terms of, I guess, part of my spiritual perspective, there is like a love and an interconnectedness that reaches you even when you're in your bed in the dark on your own, just lying there breathing. You have worth, and there are
Mm.
people fighting to change that. There are people fighting to make the future better.
Mm.
So it's really hard to hold on when you're in that position. So I
Mm.
think that's really important. Um, that speaks mostly, I think, to that identity aspect and being unproductive in a world obsessed with productivity. But I think there's another part of this that's unproductive. There's a part to do with dealing with the unknown and dealing with the unplanned. And my unfinished book manuscript is about this topic. Very unfinished. Started writing it in 2011 and I gave it a good crack in 2021. And then I was too sick. I'm going to pick it up again. But there's the unproductive part. There's dealing with the unknown, which is partly what we alluded to earlier about we feel like this is a really unknown disease. Actually, we know quite a lot about it now. We don't know everything. We don't have a complete picture, but we know some things. But there's this like culture of saying it's unknown, it's mysterious,
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
case is different. And like cases can be different, but there's also subtypes. There are a lot of people that are just like my case. There are people that are
Mm.
different, but there's a lot of people just like me. And there's actually a lot, we have more in common than what divides us, much more in common.
Mm.
So dealing with the unknown is really tricky, but it's
Mm.
tricky dealing with a culture that believes it's unknown when actually there is some that's known. I know I said the
Mm.
word known a lot just then. I think the difference is about like, is something unknown and we know that it's unknown and we're like,
Yeah,
okay, we don't know that, but we do know this.
yeah,
Is something
known
unknown
knowns.
and we can figure it out?
Yeah.
Like there's elements to the unknown, but the thing that I can't stand is this idea that it's unknown that leads to apathy. Like, well, we just don't
Mm.
know. I don't know how to help my friend. She's got ME. I don't know. I don't know. Go online. There are like 1,000 blogs on how to help a friend who is chronically ill.
Mm.
Google. Google dynamic disability. Google invisible illness. Google blogs about spoons and spoon theory. Google how to help a friend who's going through a prolonged, difficult thing in life. Might not even be about illness. Might be someone going through a prolonged period of grief. Google, Google, Google. Learn how to cook meals. Show up for people. There are things you can do.
Mm.
Don't give in to the apathy that comes with unknown. And the
Mm.
third thing of that, productive unknown, the third part is unplanned. And for me, this speaks back to identity, is that none of this was planned for any of us. None of us expected to get sick. You and I didn't expect to get sick again. And it is like there's a shock and like a fresh grief to it
Mm-hmm.
happening, and all the stages of grief with denial, anger,
Mm.
bargaining, ultimately acceptance. um, and there's another one, depression. Those are all these stages of grief. It wasn't planned, but we live in a world that tells us that if you make a plan and you tick off the boxes, then you'll be successful, or then your life will
Bucket
be.
lists. People love bucket lists, don't they, nowadays?
Yeah, and it plays into
Mm.
hustle culture. It's like, well, so we live in a world now with a cost of living crisis where even if you work full time, you can't buy a house, get a side hustle. And it's like there's just
Yeah.
this list of things to do. Like you make the plan, then you can do this, then you can buy a house, then you can have a child, then you can get married, then you can whatever it is. And life is so much more complicated than that. So much more complicated than that. But B, there is I don't know how to put it into words. There's like a connection to the truth and core of what it is to be alive that
Mm.
happens when you're dealing with the completely unplanned stuff in life. We have to adapt. We have to just be resilient. And you have to have days where you're not resilient and you completely fall apart. And you have to ask a friend to have hope for you because you do not have hope yourself that day. For me, actually, a lot more is said about what someone does during a time of where their life has been taken away from them through illness, in this case. That says a lot more about someone's character than whether or not they've just bought a yacht because they sold their company and retired at
Mm.
44. I'd much rather talk to the person that's been through disease for 20 years and be like, how did you get through? What's your perspective on like humanity?
Yeah.
There's something about it that is actually that's actually it's more normal in life for things to go wrong and for you to have to adapt than for just to tick off the boxes in your life. Occasionally I meet someone whose life genuinely seems to just have fallen into place.
Yeah,
Sometimes
I don't know
people
how
pretend
that
that
happens.
and it's not true. A couple of people I've met, I'm like, I actually think they've just had an easier life. And
Yeah.
that's their lot. And that's not my story, and that's okay.
Yeah.
What's not okay is our systems and the people who have supposed power and expertise making it more difficult than it needs to be or making you worse. That's not okay. But facing something unexpected and your whole life plan going out the window, that is okay in terms of that happens a lot in life.
Mm.
And all we can do is be in it together and create a new plan and build from there. And when you're so sick that that's not possible because you literally can't like properly eat, drink, do anything, remembering that there are a lot of us that are fighting to make that possible and to make a better future.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For
No,
me, that
it's
sort of frames my identity journey with this. But anyway, I'm
yeah.
still learning my own story, and I'm sure I'll keep learning more and unpicking more of this journey.
Yeah. It's almost like we could talk about a lot of things, couldn't we? We've talked about quite. I've just realised we've gone over the time that we sort of
I
initially planned,
know.
and
I'm getting red in the face as well. I can tell that I'm starting to hit my
then
limit.
yeah, we should stop. But it's so often harder because when you get talking actually, and for those of us with Emmy, that there often aren't easy places for us to talk about these things, and that's why I've enjoyed making the podcast, because it gives an opportunity for people to express kind of things, but also for people to listen and to kind of be thinking, yeah, I can so relate to that, and just being able to kind of relate to things that people have said online is really helpful, isn't it? And I'm sure there's so much more that we could have talked about today, and maybe we need to do another part 2 in a few months' time or something, because yeah, there's some of the things that you've touched on today have been really interesting in terms of some of the things that Dov and I have talked about on the podcast, and like on one of our recent episodes, we talked about this kind of like how do we deal with this kind of not being productive, or kind of like how do we have kind of like a position that we don't have to feel that we're kind of like working to contribute to the society in a way that becoming ill and chronically ill and unable to work kind of actually like forces us to look at society and how we view society and how society views people with disability and all these sort of things. There's a whole, you start and unpack it all. It's fascinating, isn't it? And it's and it impacts us in a really big way. And it would maybe we could talk more in the future. But I'm just aware of the time. It's been so good to hear your story and some of your thoughts. And I had to remind myself that I was like a podcast host and not just listening to a podcast, because it was it was just really good. I was like, hang on a minute, I'm listening to a live podcast. But it was really good to.
I am the inner actress though. Like once I'm given a platform, I'm like, oh, here's a microphone. Here's my whole story. So.
No, but it's been really good.
I'll learn in the future to make it more succinct, I think.
Yeah, no, it's been it's really good. Been really good to hear your thoughts, and yeah, we should definitely try and catch up again in the future. So it's been good. So
I'd love to. Thank you. And again, thank you for hosting this space and diving into these topics. As you say, I think it's really important that we have a safe space to talk about them and share them with each other. So I listen to the podcast and I can't wait to keep listening. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you.